Starliner Media. Starliner Media presents Music Night at the Majestic with your host, Michael Boswell.
All right, it's time once again for Music Night at the Majestic, and with us tonight, Brian Tarquin. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Today, it's good to talk to you. You have been involved in so many different aspects of the music business that you've had quite a journey.
Yes, that's true. I have, in the 30 plus years. It's been
yeah. Well, as we often say in the show, every musician's journey starts somewhere. So for you, grow up in a musical household?
No, my parents were, my mother was an artist. She was a modern artist from the 60s, 50s, 60s. So I grew up in a very artistic house. My dad, he loved music. He was actually a World War II veteran that he was the DJ for a lot of big bands. And he worked with Bob and Ray, who was a comedy team back in Boston in the 50s. So he actually, really loved music a lot. And my mom loved music too, but she was very artistic in the, painting and illustrating and all of that.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, did you ever get to meet Bob and Ray?
Yes, I did. I believe I met Bob. I may have met both of them. I think, yeah, sometime in the 70s.
Yeah, they had some great stuff. Very funny.
Yeah, they were a big comedy team at the time, I guess.
Yeah. Now, picking up the guitar, was that the first instrument you gravitated to?
Yeah, and actually guitar was an interesting thing because my mother had a guitar that she brought back from Mexico with her first husband. She lived down there and painted for like 4 years. And then she came back and she had this guitar. And then when she married my dad, she still had this like smaller acoustic guitar, nylon string. And I started on that. And, my parents were, pretty diligent on telling him to practice. And, and my dad used to have me sing What Do I Do with a Drunken Sailor when I was like 9 or 10 and record it on a cassette, and for him to listen to in the living room, so they then sent me to the Y, and at the Y, it was, the thing about, going to that type of thing in those days is that they didn't play contemporary music. They were playing kind of like, folksy or, Americana, and, a kid that was into, Zeppelin and the Stones and Kiss and the Beatles. It just didn't really pertain to me. And I remember that I went there just for a summer, and I remember the teacher there said, he'll never do anything with guitar. And my mom always reminded me of that. It was kind of funny. But where I started to excel is I took some guitar lessons at school. I went to St. David's. I went to all these private hoity-toity schools in New York City in the 70s. So I took a guitar lesson for the summer there, and that was really cool. That actually introduced me to like playing the electric guitar, because I remember my teacher and his assistant, we went to his house, I think over, for one day in the class, and they both picked up these like a Les Pauls and just jammed, and they weren't really doing anything but playing chords like right in front of each other, and it blew me away. I was like, wow, what power, this was the coolest thing. And so I kept moving on, and, taking, my mother would send me to like, classical Spanish guitar, and, that just didn't talk to me at all. And so I then found a guy later on, in like junior high that actually was, I think she found his name at a local A&P on 86th Street. And, or made him in Gristedes or something on like a billboard, you know, in there when you walk in. And he was a Berkeley graduate, and I got the most out of him. His name was Paul Antonelli, and he was awesome. And we just he really kind of structured it for me, like, these are the chords, this is major, minor, this is, you know, all of the different modes, this is, you know, what you can play over a major minor scale, and this is, you know, over a chord progression. And, you know, he really actually just showed me all of, like, kind of like, and also some really cool jazz voicings. And so that really kind of led my way. I still use the stuff that he showed me then, you know, God, over like 40 years ago, you know, and that I still use to this day. It's great.
Yeah. Well, tell me this: if that what was the music, the why you're not really gravitating towards the Woody Guthrie stuff that they're playing? What stuff were you gravitating to when you first started playing?
When I first started playing, you know, I really liked let's see, you know, probably those early Kiss records. They had just come out when I was a kid, so that was, you know, like Dress to Kill and all of those records, the early lineup. And so I liked that. I love Zeppelin. Zeppelin was great. And you know, it was really guitar, you know, back then it was so much guitar music, it was guitar oriented stuff. You know, I listened to 95.5, which was WPLJ in New York City, and that was the home of rock. It was, you know, there was no classic rock that had not been invented or you know, come up with. It was just AOR. You know, it was album-oriented rock, and those were mostly the stations that were there, and I listened to that all the time. And so, you know, things like the Stones, the early Stones, like Satisfaction, and the Beatles, of course, they were one of the early guys I was listening to. You know, The Who, that was another one that I really liked. I liked all of that original, you know, kind of British invasion stuff. And Aerosmith, you know, because, you know, by that point, there was only a couple of American bands, you know, that were really as big as the British invasion guys, you know, like Boston was one, Aerosmith, and Kiss had not even, you know, was just kind of like an underground thing at that point.
Right.
And so it was, you know, I liked what they were doing. I liked the blues influence that they were doing, you know, their version of blues. And then, you know, I remember my teacher, Paul Antonelli, saying, get the Beano record. It's Clapton reading you know, the Beano magazine on the cover. And I got it, and I was just like sold. It was just incredible. You know, it was just, you know, I just really liked that kind of, you know, that kind of guitar was really speaking to me at that time.
Yeah. Well, tell me this: with Kiss being a big influence, did you ever get a chance to meet Ace Frehley?
Yeah, I met Ace, actually. He signed my Les Paul, and I actually met Paul Stanley as well.
Okay.
And they were cool. You know, they were, you know, at that time, you know, in 75, 76, that was it. You know, those guys were hard and heavy, and it was cool. It was, those were kind of fun days. I remember being in 5th grade and 6th grade, and had a buddy of mine loved them, and we were always, like, you know, listening to them. And then, of course, you know, you kind of, you know, in those days, then you kind of like go backwards, you work yourself backwards of what they were influenced by, and things like that, you know, that they loved the Stones, and they loved, you know, all these great bands.
Yeah. Did you have your Kiss Army card?
I used to, yeah, a long time ago.
There's actually a guy by me who has he's got a Chevy Astro van, and it's got the Kiss Army logo on the painted on the side of it. Yeah. He's a diehard.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Paul. Did you listen to Paul's Philly Soul album from a couple of years ago?
No, I talked to him about it. I hadn't had the opportunity to listen to it, though he was really excited about that record, I remember.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, when you listen to it. Oh, what's that, Brian?
It was a complete departure. And it's funny because he was telling me that, shouted out loud, he goes, that was nothing more than a call and response, like the Temptations and things. We just did it, a lot heavier and harder. But shouted out loud was he had mentioned. He also mentioned another song. What was that? I Was Made for Loving You, and it was like it was really close to a melody that I think the Temptations had done back then. It's so he was actually really influenced by them. I was actually taken back by that because I didn't think so. I always thought he's probably a true real rocker, but
yeah. Well, I'll tell you, in listening to it, Brian, yeah, you can really hear his passion for that Philly soul sound in the Motown.
yeah,
On it.
it's and he has a really good band with him. I mean, he's got and it's a large band too, I believe.
Yes, yeah,
people in there.
But he's got obviously covers on there.
Yeah,
but the originals, there's a couple of them that they sound like they would have been time period correct with the cover when the cover versions, the originals that he does were new.
Oh,
So,
really?
Yeah. So I say because I first read about it, I went,
Yeah.
That's either going to be really good or it's not. And,
I was surprised about that whole thing, but he really had a passion for it. He was very meticulous on, I think, getting everybody to do it right.
Yeah, it comes through in the record. So
no,
if
he
you have
doesn't
a chance to listen to it, give it a spin.
Does he sing a lot on the record?
Yeah.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I say, because it's so opposite of what you think of him for, it seems like it'd be a total left field thing. Yeah. But say when you listen to it, you can hear how that he's clearly passionate about this music.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was definitely.
So, but anyway, so getting back to your stuff now that the Paul Stanley hour is completed here. So at this point, you're focused on playing. How did you wind up, getting into the engineering, the recording side of things?
It's interesting. When I first went into it, I liked music production. I thought engineering might be a way in as well to the music industry. And also, I thought it was important to probably know how everything operated. Because a lot of the guys that I really looked up to, like Jimmy Page and even Tom Schultz, all those guys, they knew, engineering. They knew producing and production and everything. And I thought that was probably a very important aspect of all of that, than just to go in and just do the record and kind of not know anything about how it's all done. When I got into it, it was still tape. We were all doing tape, cutting 1/4 inch, the whole thing. It was which was good. I still used tape. I love tape. I still have a analog studio. I think it's important. I like to mix them both, the digital and analog. I think that's the best of both worlds that you get. And it was interesting. I didn't know when I was going to music production school and I left, I didn't know like there was, I remember leaving and saying like, there's like no jobs, assistant engineers. Even then there was a million studios and there were like these, Mix magazine was like this thick back then. And still it was hard to get into a studio, to be an assistant engineer. I think everybody wanted to, be a part of that. But, I eventually did. And I worked. And that's how I got a lot of like, the early stuff going, was on the downtime I'd be able to record my own material in the studio.
Yeah. Tell me this, prior to that, would you record yourself at home and kind of come up with, try to figure out ways to make it sound like you were in a studio, even though you weren't?
Well, my dad had a Grundig reel-to-reel player, a 2-track 1/4 inch, one of those, the home stereo ones.
Right.
And I used to, what I used to do is try to bounce and double track and do all of that. I liked it a lot. I had a band too, because, this all came in, I got a band together like when I was 12 or 13. And then we were, the guys were a little older than me, and they were like in high school and I was like in junior high. And we would practice every weekend, we'd record with it. And, it was, that was probably the training ground of doing everything, because we would edit the tape and splice them together and try to do, kind of little experiments and all of that. So that was kind of like the first, thing that I started doing was fooling around with 1/4-inch tape and editing. Also in those days, tape machines and recording equipment were very expensive. It's not like today, you buy a computer and everything's in it and you just hit the space bar. It's like, it's like, if you were even to buy a 4-track machine, I mean, it was like, $10,000, $15,000. I mean, it was, those studios, they would have to a lot of those studios would just lease those machines because they were so expensive. It was a different, definitely, if you wanted to do it done correctly, you had to go to a studio. That there was no kind of way around it at that point.
Yeah. That's one of the things that we touch on frequently, on the show, is talking about how technology has changed so much to where now, if you're starting out, you've got access to more technology to record yourself, at home than what studios had not all that many years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe it's, at my age, it seems like not that many years ago.
Yeah.
It's a lot of stuff that I did that other folks tell me, man, that was a long time ago. Like, no, it wasn't that long ago.
No,
At least
yeah.
from my perspective.
Digital has not been around that long. You figure everybody moved about 20 years ago, something like that, maybe.
Yeah, actually,
the end of the 90s, very early.
Yeah, I mean, it was mid 86 somewhere, in there is when you first really started to see, the full digital recording, logos on albums. And stuff.
Yeah, that's right, David. And those machines were still tape, but they were digital tape.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that because GRP did a lot of those. Recordings, with those special machines, and then you started seeing that. But for the average guy to get that, the closest that came was then, affordability was the mid '90s with ADATs and D88s.
Right.
That was the I think the first step towards the whole thing.
Yeah, but personally, I like the warmth that you get. Analog.
Yeah.
I appreciate the crispness and the detail and everything that you get full digital, but it's almost seems a little sterile.
Here's a tape machine for you. If you can see that.
Yeah.
And then this one, that's an Atari 2-inch MTR 90. And then this is an Ampex 440C. That's from the 70s. That's a 1/4-inch that you do masters on. But yeah, I really am an analog guy, and I have a Trident recording console from the 80s that I've refurbished. But I have, when I do digital, I put digital goes through the desk, and I have all the analog outboard gear, and I can manipulate it that way and use the EQs on the desk and all of that. It's interesting because back in the day when it was all analog, it was tough to get good sounds. Unless you were in a big, $500 an hour studio and you had a really good engineer. And then if you all digital, you're missing something. You're missing that warmth from the drums and the bass and the low end. So I found doing both, combining them is probably the best of both worlds and the best way to do it, because it's a strange thing, because with analog, I remember us always trying to get separation, to separate the instrument, because with analog, especially if you weren't using a 2-inch, you were using, say, a 16 track half-inch. Then you'd get noise, and then you'd get everything kind of mushed together, and so we're always trying to get everything separated. Digital separates everything. So now guys are trying in digital format to find something to actually put it back together again, which I think
Exactly.
it's funny. We went from one extreme to the other, but
Yeah, but I mean, but that's like listening to Supertramp albums, for example. Listen to those 70s recordings,
oh yeah,
and with the technology that they had to record those, and how crisp and clean they sound, but
oh yeah,
yet did it all with all analog.
oh I know, yeah. And they worked at really good studios as well. Same with Steely Dan stuff. Steely
Oh
Dan,
yeah, absolutely.
that was all analog, but you put that on now, it sounds so good.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
just, that's the bar has been lowered, because if you listen to, mainstream music today, it doesn't have that sound.
No.
Anymore. I always tell my kids it sounds like a bunch of demos, I'm listening to here on the radio, but but
You're not going to get an argument from me.
yeah.
Well, it's almost as though the human element outside of the vocals, it's like the human element has been removed from so
Yeah.
much of it.
And so many of the vocals are just technologically altered too,
I
that
was
it
gonna say
becomes,
they've been finessed.
yeah, exactly. And they
Uh,
almost sound robotic too. I mean, I know they're
mhm.
purposely trying to do that, but it's strange, and it's like streaming. It's a funny thing with streaming, because when I listen to streaming, there's information missing to me. It's like it's not all there. It's almost like an
Mhm.
apparition of itself, because if you put the album on and then you listen to that, you could tell a difference. I mean, most people who stream today is the younger generation. They don't know the difference, so
Right.
it doesn't matter. But it's just funny, because I think Neil Young put it right. He said you're only getting like 10% of the song, or like 20% of the song. It's missing all the rest.
Mhm. Exactly. That's why I still like to put listen to music through the sound system, with everything through my clips, and I can hear everything coming straight from the LP or straight from the disc, and I'm not listening to compressed files that that have, that
Yeah,
just sound, awful.
they do. They do. It sounds really bad.
Yeah.
It's I don't know what it is. I think it's because we also know the song, and so we know what it's supposed to sound like. So when you listen to like this version of it, you're like, oh, totally missing something.
Mhm.
And if you're
Yeah.
listening for the first time, I guess it wouldn't matter, because maybe you think that's the way the song sounds. But
Right. It's like the downside is if you've heard it the way it should be, and then you hear, the streaming version or what have you, it just doesn't sit well, you
no,
know?
it doesn't. I think it's funny. I think consumer always goes with the kind of the lowest common denominator. They did with VHS. Beta was a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
VHS, because it was cheaper, and and most people didn't care. So,
Right.
and that's I guess, and this is kind of the same thing with streaming, and I guess people just don't really care in the end of the day, as long as it's on, and it's free, that's
There you go,
yeah.
the 240 lines of resolution of VHS, wasn't as important as the convenience and the control you had over watching what you wanted when you wanted, or just being able to record something that you could never previously do so.
That's
So,
exactly it. Yeah,
you know, but say,
yeah.
but when you watch it, it's just it's hard to believe. It's like, wow, people were amazed with this level of quality, and then
Uh,
now 40 years later, you're sitting there with 8K in your living room.
It's funny because, I'll put on old VHS that I recorded, 100 years ago, watch it. I go, how in the hell did I watch this?
Exactly.
Unwatchable. But I guess
We
you get
thought this
used,
was good.
what you got.
Well, tell you, so we keep things moving forward here. So, you, you obviously grew up in New York, did your original studio stuff New York, then you headed west to California. What inspired the change of coasts?
At the time I went to California. I wanted to be a director. I wanted to be Cecil B. DeMille. I wanted to kind of was really interested. I had a Bolex 16 millimeter camera, and I thought, oh, this is going to be cool. And when I got there, I realized, wow, this is going to be a lot tougher than it seemed, because everybody starts from the bottom there. It was very political as far as getting into production like that and being a director. And, a lot of it had to do with, there were people that went to school for, years for this and still were just production assistants directing traffic. So I was kind of and I saw how big music was. It was huge. It was everywhere. And by that point, I had already had some success with a Guitar Magazine wrote me up, and then there was and then they took my music for the '92 Olympics. And so by that point, I thought, well, this would be going backwards. You'd have to start from the bottom of the ladder again, doing something like that. So I thought, I'm just going to go with music, because it's so huge here anyway, and everybody's into it. And so that's initially why I went out there. I thought, well, maybe I'll just stay the summer and see how it works out. And I stayed over 11 years. So it was it was, there was so much opportunity in LA, way more than in New York City at the time. For music and for a lot of things, because there were a lot of people in the same boat as you, and a lot of people, like-minded, and also came there to do similar things. So it was, it seemed like there was a lot more hope to, kind of have a career there than New York City. So that's really kind of why I went to, originally, and then I stayed.
And then you wound up getting your music into TV shows that you may have directed if the visual aspirations had paid out.
Right. That it was funny because I started speaking with these guys that would have these music catalogs, and they were needed music, and I would have a song, or they wanted me to write something, and then they started placing it, and placing it in, Spellings 90210 and all these shows that were big at the time. And it was, it just kind of it was a momentum that gradually kept getting bigger and bigger. And so it was a cool thing. And at the same time, I was doing records. So.
Yeah. To tell me this, Brian, with the, with the TV songs, for lack of a better description, how many was it frequently a case where you were having to write for a scene, or did they more often take something that you already had done that they heard and then place it into a scene?
In the beginning, it was the latter. It was basically, I had the song, they took it, and they licensed it and used it in the episode. As things went on, then I would talk to producers and things, and then they would need something for scenes. And so I would then, try to write for these, I would compose something for them. And as it worked out, I did contemporary jazz at the time. It became smooth jazz, but it was NAC originally. And I had a number of hits on there. on all those stations, and I toured. That's how I met Chuck Loeb, and a lot of guys. Dave Cause. I toured with all those guys, and they were on the same circuit. Kenny G, George Benson, and all those. So what happened was, there were shows that were starting to just use, license it, but then they hired me and said, well, why don't you just write for us, and that way they could own it, and they wouldn't have to license it from the record company, and then it would be an easier thing. And so that's it kind of morphed into then just writing, strictly, like composing for what exactly they needed for each scene or whatever they wanted.
When you would do that, would they, give you a tape of the episode that you were writing for to watch it and then compose to it? Or would they say, just kind of give you a verbal direction of what they needed?
Both, because with TV, there was never enough time. Especially, I got into doing daytime television and doing a lot. So they were filming every day. They would just tell me what what style, what they needed, maybe give me a couple of samples. On films that I did, they would give me the scene that they needed music for, and then that way you'd have a little more time, to kind of produce and kind of score to the scene. So usually, it was a little of both, I would say, that really kind of managed to do the composing end of it. Sometimes, they would be like, we need like 10 cues like this. And so they would give me some examples and I would just write them, so.
Which did you find to be the bigger challenge? Writing something with a verbal cue, and hoping that their description gave you enough info, or writing to a visual?
I guess they have both their challenges. I mean, the writing to the visual is cool, but sometimes, directors have a way of changing their mind a lot. Film was a very kind of, how should I say this? They were kind of fickle. So, they would change their mind and then they'd go, I've seen them go back, have you do everything, go around, do a million changes, and then they wind up using what was in the temp track to begin with. So it's a tricky little thing, but the easiest would definitely be if they tell you, the verbal, because they'll give you samples and then they'll do it. They'll tell you what you want, what they want. It's easier when they know what they want and they have an example of what they want. When you get to a point where, when there's less direction and less knowing what they want, it always winds up to be trouble, because when you don't know what you want, they'll keep changing it, and because they don't know what they want. So, and it kind of changes daily with some of these people. So it's a challenge, either way. But, I think I like writing for definitely people who definitely like to know what they want.
I can see where that would be a plus.
Yeah.
Now tell me this, of the stuff that you would write and then the fickle director would say, no, we're going to go in a different direction. Were you able to save any of those pieces that didn't end up working and use them for something later?
Yeah, I could do that. Yeah, that definitely would happen. Yeah. Sometimes what would happen is they wind up using it for something else in later in the film or the scene or something, and then just have you rewrite it for that particular scene.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a lot of hands, when you get to film, there's a lot of hands in, because you got a producer, director, music supervisor, and then you have an editor, but with TV, because of the time frame is restraint, you only have the editor really and the music supervisor, and usually music supervisors just getting the songs for the editor anyway. Music supervisor's job is really just to clear everything, So it, and it depends who you're working with. If you get to know them, then you know what they want, or what they're looking for. So it's, it's one of those things you have to feel out as you go through.
Yeah. What was it like winning the 3 Emmys?
Oh, it was cool. Yeah, it was great. It was something I didn't expect, but it was cool. It was for all my children, and I was on that show for like 10 years, and it was an honor, obviously to win something like that, and for composing, and I think that's what I came up when I left LA. I came home with my first son and or my oldest son, and then an Emmy, and so I came back to New York. But it was kind of a little surreal, but it was definitely rewarding. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Now I had read that when you were in California, you were living in Jim Morrison's old apartment.
Yeah.
Was that just by chance, or did you go, "Hey, did you search it out?"
No, this is totally by chance. I was living oh man, it was like, I think it was 1764 Sycamore. It was between right in Hollywood, right between Franklin and Hollywood Boulevard. And it used to be, it was everybody from MIT would go there, would live there, because MIT was in walking distance. So it was like the riot street. It was so loud. It was crazy. People would be playing, drums in their apartment. And we were kind of the only building that was kind of, the sane one. And I had an apartment on the side, but it was facing this building. It was crazy. So the manager said, "I have a special apartment I want you to move to," because I was like, "Do you have something I can go is a little quieter?" And it was in the back of the building, and she said it was Jim Morrison's apartment. He used to go down there and from his Hollywood Hills to kind of escape all the groupies and to write poetry and books, and it really just kind of just get away and have some peace. So, but yeah, it was kind of cool.
Now, I'd also read that the building that you grew up in, that building was used as the exterior establishing shot for the Jeffersons. That was supposedly their building.
Yeah, that's the Round Terrace's building. That's what it was. Yeah. I remember getting picked up from school, and everybody always used to ask me, how's George Jefferson in there? And everybody thought, they actually lived there. But, of course, it was all done in Hollywood. But it was definitely a conversational piece.
I'm sure it was. Well, tell you mentioned doing your jazz albums. 96 Ghost Dance.
Right.
What was it like going in to record that first album?
That album actually was a collection of demos that I had done for a year and a half. What had happened was, it was I would go and basically self-fund this and go to studios where I knew I could get some decent time and everything. And one studio was a dear friend of mine, Jeff Gray, who had worked for him in Far and Away Studios when he was in New York. Now he had moved it now to Boulder, Colorado. But then he was there. So when I came back and visited my parents, I used to go just do a bunch of songs with him, and we would do these songs for some libraries that wanted me to write for them, and some shows, and of course for the album. And then I would in LA I had a connection at a Hollywood studio called Room 335, and I would do some songs there. So it was really kind of comprised of those two studios where I did it. I was, when I did Ghost Dance, I was thinking of one of the things that I liked about contemporary jazz at that moment was the acid jazz movement, and it was cool. Like a guitarist like Ronnie Jordan, and he was great. I really liked his grooves. I thought it was forward thinking, and you didn't really hear anything like that at that time, on radio. And I had previous to that, I was doing live shows at as more of a fusion Jeff Beck, Satriani instrumental. In places like, the Roxy, up and down the Sunset Strip, Whiskey and, the Baked Potato, Bourbon Street and the Valley. There was a host of places. And so I finally said, after listening to The Wave a bunch of times, I thought, well, at that moment, rock was kind of going out, and rock and instrumental music is a difficult music to get across to people anyway. It's a very difficult thing because without the lyrics, people just can't. It's hard for average people to really, grasp it. And if you get too jazz or fusion, it's just, it's too deep for them. So I thought what I originally would have called it was, like adult contemporary instrumental. And so I thought, well, this is kind of a cool thing. I thought we could probably re-record these, we get a label to release it. And then I finally said, you know what, let's just get this all together and see if we can get somebody to license it or see what they'd be interested in. And those I noticed in those days, the Wave was very popular, in CD 101 and all of that. And though they were very different, like CD 101 was more like an urban jazz thing, where the Wave in LA was more like really, I don't want to say new age, but it was like, more adult contemporary and not so jazz oriented, where they would play Tuck and Patty, and they play a lot of Windham Hill artists, and they would play, the older Pat Metheny stuff, like American Garage and Off Ramp and things. And I thought, this is kind of a cool place. I believe that the music that I was writing could be altered to do that, as a lead instrument, the guitar, and, of course, bringing the sax. So that's kind of what I planned on doing. And then Jazz Inspiration, who was distributed by MCA in Toronto, in Canada, they released it. And then at that point, I needed to get really, at that point, they kind of like started to change to the smooth jazz urban thing, all those stations. So I had to think of a way to go further. So I got a programmer kind of into the fold, Chris Ingram, who was a pianist. And so he started programming all the stuff for the first record that I did with Instinct Records, Last Kiss Goodbye, where that was a big record. So that kind of came out the following year. But, and they had sent me to London to do that one. So long story, that's kind of how, Ghost Dance kind of came about.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned recording in London. Was there a difference in approach or technique in recording London versus recording here in the States?
Yeah, well, with the studios that I was going to, for Ghost Dance, because it was a limited budget at that time, didn't have, they had like Fostex machines that were 16-track half-inch, and and like Allen and Heath or Soundcraft desks and stuff. So it was lower on the totem pole for sonic sound. When I went to London, then I was always, we're in a studio with, Atari machine, 2-inch machine with, a proper Neve desk and, just all this good equipment. And it's just, it was a lot different in the sense that, he was producing it. Ernie McCohen was he engineered and produced it in his studio called Boogie Back Studios in London. And so that that was a total win. It was great because he knew exactly what to do. They wanted me to work with him because he was producing all their acid jazz records for their artists at that time. And so they wanted to say, because at the time I thought, well, why don't we just go to a good studio and go in New York City? You know, I mean, that's where they were, or LA, you know. But I think it was the producer that they wanted, and his sound, which was coming from his studio. And so they flew me there, and it was cool. It was great. So we did the album within 2 weeks. You know, everything. The band came. You know, the musicians came in. We played, and it was a wrap. It was actually a lot quicker, and it also was focused, and it just kind of we knew exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
Was streamlined very well.
Yeah, and then Last Kiss Goodbye, you had One Arabian Night, which was a very successful track.
Yeah, One Arabian Night and Freeway Jam. That was on the flip side. That was a remake of the Jeff Beck song. So yeah, that they wound up doing very well.
Yeah. The after the jazz period, you got back to your rock roots. What was the moment where you decided, okay, I've taken this as far as I want to go with it. Now we're going to try something else.
Yeah, with that, it got to the point where, radio was very restrictive for the jazz records, smooth jazz. Smooth jazz radio became more and more and more and more restrictive. So they were like, just, I'll give you an example. Soft Touch was my next record, and we did that remake of the OJ's, Darling, Darling Baby, which was a hit. And half the stations didn't like the soprano sax, so they wanted, I think there was an alto sax on it. They didn't like the alto sax. So half the stations would play it, and the other half, the important ones, wanted a soprano sax. So they actually went back and remixed it with a soprano sax and sent it to those stations. So, it was kind of more and more like that kind of thing, where it was, they were being restrictive, and I thought they were being kind of, I don't know, outlandish, it's like you can live with the alto sax, with the soprano sax, you know what I mean? They were being really, I thought, way too overbearing, and I think that's, to be honest with you, why smooth jazz, kind of crash and burned, as far as radio goes, because they were so restrictive that I remember Bud Harner over at Blue, where was he? He was at Verve. That's right. He was at Verve, and he was the head of A&R. And he said, I remember him being really angry because he was like, we had a #1 hit the entire summer, and I sold 3,000 records with this artist. And I was like, yeah, I know. And so they were even back then, this is the late 90s, maybe 2000. And I think they wanted to get out of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And I think because one, it wasn't generating enough sales, and two, radio was being really restrictive. And so in that sense, I did my last one for them, High Life, which was a little more fusion for instant records. And then I felt like, I think that, I feel like I'm starting to go down that repeating road, which I hate. So I went into something I really liked that I was already doing for television, was rock electronica. And so we were doing this like, Chemical Brothers, Crystal Method kind of thing. It did very well at television and film placement. It did great, got a lot of play on that. It did well at CMJ, radio, RPM charts. And then, that kind of ran its course, because, I found that audience was very, because Jeff Beck did it, and they were really restrictive on him. I mean, they were very critical on him, and because they didn't like guitar. That format of electronica did not like guitar, no matter how you put it. They still didn't like it, and so I felt, well, I did this phase. I think that was kind of like, the end of what I could do with it. So I opened up a label, BHP Music, and I said, I'm going to do guitar instrumental stuff, and I want to do like, Guitar Master Series. So I started out, going back to my roots. I wanted to do guitar fusion. I really wanted to do the Jeff Beck, Satriani, that kind of vibe, because I really liked it, and I just thought it just there was an audience for it out there, and so I put together these series, and so I would, the first one, volume 1, I licensed tracks, that had Jeff Beck on it, and Joe Satriani on it, and Stanley Clarke, and I did a lot of licensing on those. For the first 2 probably, and then I started writing my own, and so I came out with my first like rock instrumental solo album was Fretworks, and I got a bunch of guys who I really always admired, like Steve Morse, Billy Sheehan, Frank Gambale. I got a whole host of guys, and I composed the songs, and then I would have them come in and do kind of solos. Guest solos on them. So that's kind of how I mentally got into that.
Yeah, well, you're talking about smooth jazz radio from a listener's perspective. To me, it sounded as though the radio was basically acting as its own focus group.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And it was just a case of where, nope, we don't want this, we don't want that. We want these 5 things, these 5 elements in every record. And then all of a sudden it went from being a very eclectic, interesting mix to, 12 songs in an hour that basically sounded like one extended mix.
Yeah, it was absolutely, we just joke around about it. That was like, because that it sounded like a different sax player would come in and play over the same, basic tracks. It was, they got one producer that would do all this stuff the exact same way because he had success with other artists. So every radio station thought, well, everything's got to sound like that. And that was the death of the format. I mean, you can always like pinpoint the day that happened, because, when they kind of coined that whole phrase of smooth jazz and vocals, that was like, really the beginning of the end, because what would happen is half the time they would turn the station into a recurrent station for vocals. So they would be playing like Mariah Carey old songs, Phil Collins, Tony Braxton, and then they would have the other half would be instrumentals, but the instrumentals would all sound exactly the same. I mean, exactly the same. It was, I mean, they didn't even mix up like the ensemble, the ensemble, it was like exactly the same instruments, same backing instruments, same lead instruments. It was really bad. It was something that, I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall on the last record. And then, when I did High Life, I asked for a release of the album, because I said, from the deal, because I said, I see that this format's not going to last. It can't last if they become so restrictive and only allow certain sounds. And I think that also really kind of reverberated with the record companies, even the major record companies, Warner Brothers and Verve and Blue Note and all of they had artists on there, and they just thought, this is ridiculous. How can you have a format that's going to be this repetitive? And from a listener's point of view, as you said, I mean, it's like it was cool at one time. They'd play
Mhm.
Weather Report. They would play Return to Forever and Chicoria and all these cool Al Di Meola and all these cool artists. And then all of a sudden, they would only play one style of music, that it
Mhm.
could not be. And so all those artists were never being played any longer. And it would be, a Rick Braun who would sound like, a million Rick Brauns that would sound that way, or a Boney James that would sound that way. And the same producer was producing all of that. So I remember talking to Larry Carlton once about this, and he said, you know what? He said, those guys may have, hits, but I can't see it being very rewarding artistically, because what they're doing is just playing the same thing over and over again on each release. And as you said, you can't fool the listeners on that.
Mhm.
It may work for selling Coke commercials for Philadelphia's major radio station or LA, but it's not going to work on having a format that's going to have a long lasting, effect. And so, there we go. And then it died. And CD 101 was probably one of the last ones that died. And that was probably, oh my God, probably 15 years ago. So it's too bad, because it could have been a really long lasting format if they
Mhm.
had just kept with their original idea and not being so, they became kind of like seclusive, but to the point of like choking it.
Oh, exactly. Well, you mentioned the wave. I remember when uh, the wave started in Chicago back in '85.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And when it first came on, it was an interesting mix of some of the more unique AC songs that had a jazz influence, if you
Yeah.
will, combined with, or even some, uh, remember them playing, the Pat Metheny, David Bowie, you know, uh,
Oh, yeah.
America thing, where you wouldn't expect Bowie to be there, you
No,
know, to hear
no,
his
that was
vocals
great. That's
on.
off the soundtrack, The Falcon and the Snowman.
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
that. That's a great album. Right. They would play that. And Michael Hedges, who was like this, who played the harp guitar. And there was a lot
Mhm.
of really cool things that, that they were
Yeah,
playing, and
and
then
it
they,
was it yeah, exactly.
cut it off. They literally cut it off. They all of the people that they had been supporting for years, like one day they just stopped playing. I mean, Wyndham Hill would called them up and said, "Well, why aren't you playing this any longer?" And they said, "Well, we moved formats to smooth jazz." And I mean, it's it was a crazy time, And I don't, it was one thing if they had incorporated it, but they just took it over, and then they really became more and more restrictive as the time. Well, it was like, I think they abuse of power, that they had over radio, but they
There
wound
were a few egos out of control.
yeah, and they wound up shooting themselves in the foot. Half of those stations in the country wound up not even picking their music. They went to a place called Broadcast Architecture, and they were an outside consultant that told them what to play. And they had their own focus group, but they would actually have them play it. And the way that the focus group worked is they put these people in a room and play the song. And if they liked it, they would make it louder. And if they didn't like it, they made it lower. And that really is not a way of judging the song. Um, it
Well,
was crazy focus things that were going on in those days. And it was really, really quite sad, to see something that out of control and everybody just stand by and watch, but
I don't care what the subject matter is, a focus group is the fastest way to mediocrity.
yeah, right. And that and
You
that
know?
and that was and it was funny. They were the most honest stations. They were probably the only one of the few that were incorruptible, but they were basing everything on these focus groups, and it was,
Mhm.
in its way, was kind of corruptible. I don't know. It was a crazy way. I remember talking to Tom Scott explaining how broadcast architecture worked when he was doing a show, and he just couldn't believe it. It
Mhm.
was he just couldn't understand. He goes, what happens if the song is low and you had to raise it to listen to it? Yeah, I said, it's nuts.
That gets back to my theory that men in suits shouldn't have any sway in the decision about music.
Well, it was all about the marketing pie charts and the graphs, of what they would do. It was, remember Arbitron, the whole thing about how you would do, in the ratings and everything they based on it. All of this on charting, and as far as how many listeners were there and what they would do and when. And, as we know now, radio has so much trouble, because
again, there's so many formats where the repetitiveness is just so ridiculous.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. I remember even 30 years ago, the oldies station in Chicago only had about 400 songs in their library.
Well,
now how you can cover, 30 or so years worth of music and only have 400 songs is beyond me.
Yeah, that is incredible, and it didn't sound like they were using all of the 400 songs,
Right. But you knew at 4:15 it was, I should say you knew it was 4:15 because, Sugar Pie Honey Bunch was playing. So.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Because it was just, they would just repeat the clock over and over and over. It's like, you could tell time by what song.
Yeah. Well, that's everything is automated now. So that's what they do. They just repeat and it doesn't matter. It's, the whole thing about in the 80s when large radio stations were buying everything, radio stations everywhere. There used to be, you used to buy it. You could buy a radio station for not that much. Today, even the smallest one in Spokane or somewhere, wherever, would be like, millions of dollars because it's just, now it's, everything's overvalued that way.
Right. And with the deregulation Act of 94, now the number of owners has decreased so much because, you have one owner that's got an unbelievable amount of stations. So the amount of independent stations that program independently and local radio, unless you get into small towns, that's pretty much over.
Yeah. Clear Channel's one of the biggest culprits of that.
Yeah, because you used to be able to have regional differences where songs would be more popular in one region of the country than the other, and they would play local acts that would break out, and you could hear the difference in that sound from a Memphis band to a New Orleans act to Chicago to Philly, LA, what have you, and now everything sounds the same.
Yeah, right. You had a Philly sound, a New York sound, a Detroit sound. Now you don't. That did away a long time ago. When everybody bought these stations, they just programmed them the same. You wouldn't know where you were if you had your eyes closed unless you heard the weather report. It's just, it's too bad. It's too bad because radio was a real important thing.
Exactly. I'll tell you what, Brian, for the sake of time here, I'm going to jump forward to 2014 with the you and the Heavy Friends.
Yes.
Tell us about that project.
Yeah, I came up with Heavy Friends then. That was the first one. That was guitars for Wounded Warriors. I've done, let's see, we've done 3 of those so far. It was Brian Tarquin and Heavy Friends for guitars for Wounded Warriors. Then I did one for guitars for veterans. And then I did this new one, which is Brothers in Arms.
Yeah. Now the new one, I want to make sure that we let people know that a portion of the proceeds from these records goes to support Fisher House Foundation.
Yes, they're great. They're a great place. They really help veterans' families when they're hospitalized, and they give them housing and everything. They this album I'm really proud. I think it was my best record. I've got Joe Satriani has always been, a big idol of mine. I loved him. And so he's on it. We got Vinnie Moore on it from UFO, and he's a big instrumental guy. And I tried to get all the instrumental cats on board on this for a real rock thing, real rock feeling. I also tried to get guys I didn't work with before as well. Though I did work with Ron Bumblefoot Thal before, so he's on it. He's great. We have Jeff Duncan from Armored Saint. Another guy I really enjoyed working with. He was a young kid from Germany, and his name is Johannes Weik, and he's on 2 songs, D-Day and Hounds of Hell. And basically, he is a young guy, probably in his 20s, and he's in this band called Son of a Bach, and it's great. They dress up like they're Amadeus, and they play this like heavy metal kind of neoclassical music. And it was good to see a young cat really be into guitar music, because let's face it, young guitar music is not that big any longer. And so kind of been all over the place. It's butt guitar. Guitar is no longer the cultural instrument of rebellion. And so it's kind of like the instrument. My kids view it the instrument of your grandpa. You know what I mean? And nobody likes it. Nobody uses it. It's all in the box computer stuff today. But one experience I had that's new with this is that I used the Budapest Orchestra for Hounds of Hell. And that was a new thing for me, because I had to put a temp track of strings in there, and then I sent the song over to Budapest, and they actually recorded live strings and everything. They filmed it. It was just completely awesome, and we did this fantastic version. I had to fly in, now talking about, you got to be on your game as an engineer. I had like hundreds of tracks here. I had to fly them in, line them up, make sure it's in the song correctly, and do all of that. So, with this record, and like Guitars for, Wounded Warriors and the others, I started out recording, I record all the drums and the bass and guitars on 2-inch tape, and then I transfer them over to digital. And that way I can fly in people's parts and then fly in everything. And then I'll mix it down to analog tape. And then from tape, it went to be mastered right off the tape. So it was a great experience. I had a great time doing it. I did it over the pandemic, and I was able to basically, ensure time-wise, I had a lot of time. Because everybody was on a lockdown too. And so, I took my time getting this together. So I'd probably never be able to have that much time again. But I did another one too, called Bands of Brothers Doix, and Doix. And that's coming out later in the year. And now this one is a jazz fusion one that's going to be coming out. And it has Eric Johnson, Robin Ford, Jean-Luc Ponty, Steve Morris, just a host of really great players, and being really more on the fusion, as this one was more of a hard rock one. I came out with 19 songs when I was done with the pandemic, and so I decided I don't want to get them lost on one record. I want to do this, and they broke up pretty nicely into 2 genres.
Yeah. Tell me this, Brian, for these records where you bring in somebody like Vinnie, who was on the show just a couple of weeks ago, actually.
Oh, was he?
Do you do it to where you basically, leave a space for them? Like you do the song, but you go, okay, here, this is your time from this point to this point. Do what you want to do.
Basically, I do that. Some of them I do, like with Jean-Luc Ponty. I did it where you would, he played the melody with me. So he had the melody too, and then I'd leave like maybe an intro of 8 bars, and he can make an intro kind of thing. And then in the middle, I give him a long section so he can stretch. Sometimes I leave it up to them and say, listen, if you hear something else, maybe do the melody with me, or maybe answer or something in that nature, then do that. I'm pretty, I leave it pretty open for them so they don't have to do anything, like restrictive. I usually, like with Vinnie, I told him, hey man, just take that section and do what you do, and because a lot of, I wrote these songs for them, even with guitars that you asked earlier, guitars for Wounded Warriors, I wrote them for them, like Billy Sheehan, I had completely ready for Black Hawk. And I said, play the bass, do that, do, and do what you do. Cause I take into account their style, take into account the way they play. And so I leave it open,
Tell me this, did your time writing for film and TV help you in
Yeah.
being able to write for them?
Oh yeah, definitely. Everything helps through history, what you do. So, what I learned, because I learned a lot from if we go back to, Ernie McCohen and, Boogie Back Studios, when I was doing those jazz records, I take stuff that I learned there and I still apply them, in certain sections, what I do now. And what you kind of like go through all of this experience the past 30 plus years. And I go, okay, I remember when I could do it like this, or I remember he did this like this. Let me try that and see if it works. And I remember, oh yeah, that show I did, maybe this kind of, I can apply that to this. So I always, everything helps, your current project. Draw.
That's where a good memory serves you well.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me this, I know a lot of folks be interested. What is your go-to guitar or a couple of your go-tos?
Go-to guitar, that's a good question. I have a Gibson Les Paul custom. It's a 99, I believe. Oh no, it's a 97, I think. And it's a custom shop. It's great. I love it. It's probably one of the nicest ones I have. I have a 77 Les Paul Deluxe Gold Top. I go to that a lot. And because that has the mini humbuckers, I get a different sound than the custom. I have a Strat that's from I think 2000 that I really like. I changed the neck on it. I did the pickups in it, Seymour Duncan pickups. It's a really cool Strat. I like that one. I also built one over the pandemic. I basically, it's an SG. It's do you see that?
Yeah.
I made that.
Oh wow.
Yeah, over the pandemic, an SG. I put a whole lot of pickups in it from Seymour Duncan, and it's great. It sounds great, and I made it. I actually carved that cut it out of a piece of mahogany.
Okay.
And painted it, and I actually used it on Brothers in Arms, on Hounds of Hell, actually, and I think a couple others. But it was, that's. Those are my amps. I have a Plexi that is been done with the Mark Cameron. What is that? The mod, and it sounds really good. It's kind of similar to the EVH one sounding. So that's like a go-to amp for me, and also I have a 78 Mesa Boogie. Mark II that is a go-to. So, and a 70, I actually have a 69 twin. I'm not twin, Super Reverb Fender.
Okay.
That I like a lot.
Yeah, I'll tell you, you mentioned several different Les Pauls. Did you ever get a chance to meet him?
Yes, I did. I met him several times. In fact, Jeff Gray, who was he was my mentor, engineer mentor way back when, in the late 80s, early 90s, he knew Les. And he had met Les really at a time when Les wasn't popular. Like no one cared. It was like the 70s. And Les kind of like the early 70s, he kind of lost I guess, popularity at that time because, he had been out of circulation for a while, and the Les Paul had been out of circulation too, because I think he renewed it in the 70s, the Les Paul. He kept it out from, I think it's from the entire 60s until like the late 69 for out of production, because he didn't want his ex-wife to get the royalties from it. So he waited until the divorce was finalized, and he went back and he got, which I was like, hey, that's a great move.
Shrewd and a player.
He was great. He took me to Les's house and in Mahwah in New Jersey. And it was this gigantic house it looked like a Gibson factory blew up in it. He had Les Paul bodies everywhere, pickups, necks, and he also had Ampex tape machines everywhere. It was amazing. It was actually amazing. And he was building this studio at the time in his house as well. So I did get to meet him. I met him several times. He actually signed my Les Paul too. And he actually had, he used to play a place called before the Iridium, it was Fat Tuesdays. And it was downtown, and we went down there. It was great. And he was a ball of laughs, that guy. He really was something else. So, it was funny. I never was a Les Paul in the beginning. I always played Strats because, Van Halen always was a big influence. And, with the Super Strat, I was always like really into it. And so in the 80s, I had, basically Super Strats. And in the 90s, I moved over to Gibson. When I went to jazz, I moved over to a 335, which I love. I love 335s. They're great. And, but, all of those records, except for High Life, I did that on the Les Paul, 78 Les Paul Gold Top. But the other two I did on a Telly. It was like a Paisley pink reissue Telly. I did those two, like The Last Kiss Goodbye. And so it was, but I'm a Gibson guy for the most part. I do like Strats, but Gibsons are, they're made so solid, and I can go to, you can almost get any Gibson off the shelf and it plays really well. Fenders have a tendency, I don't know, they're hit and miss, when you get them. So.
Well, it's good to know that you're in good shape right from the get-go, as opposed to hoping that it might be, what you're looking for.
Yeah, I always noticed that when getting one of the nicest ones, though, I have to say, is I have I think a 2020 Jeff Beck signature Fender, and that actually was set up very nicely. That's good. Though it is hit and miss with, I don't know what it is. You get a lot of Fenders with their necks. They tend to get the fret sprouts along the, and I don't know if it's because, some of the wood is just not, dried thoroughly, and it continues to dry, and the frets, out of the sides. But it's the way it is. You can get like 5 Les Pauls, and they'll all sound different, and they'll all feel different. And the same thing with Fenders, because I guess in the end of the day, it's only just a piece of wood. So all the characteristics are how it's dried and how it's been aged and all of that.
Right. Well, my take has always been instruments are tools that the creative human creates something with.
Right.
So
exactly it.
But tell me this, Brian, I know there's a lot of stuff we just didn't have time to get to, but is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure we mention?
No, just go out and support Fisher House Foundation. There's a link to where you can donate to as well. I believe I sent it to.
Yeah, in fact, we've got the website scrolling across the bottom of the screen at the moment.
Cool.
I'll tell you what. On that note, we'll bring this one to a close. Brian, thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Everybody, thanks for watching. Have a good night.
This has been Music Night at the Majestic with Michael Boswell. If you enjoyed this edition of Music Night at the Majestic, follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and at musicnight.net. Music Night at the Majestic is a copyright production of Starliner Media. Any use of the accounts and descriptions of this program, its audio or visual content, without the express written consent of Starliner Media is prohibited. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll see you next time for Music Night at the Majestic. This is your announcer speaking. Starliner Media.